I'm so glad to have this opportunity to describe some of my research and to reflect what I have learned through my own research in the past 6 years since I joined the UK. As you can see, the title of my presentation is The Disturbances as a Key Driver of Forest Landscape Structure, Function, and Ecosystem Service. Let me just make sure that I have everything here. Lately, I often start my presentation with this slide to show the beautiful Earth. It reminds me that although we are from different places with different backgrounds, we actually share the same home, which is the planet of Earth. And what makes the Earth special is that it supports the life, and the life is beautiful. One important life form is the forest. Forests can affect a lot of ecosystem processes, including the land surface processes. In this example, it shows that the forest can absorb a lot of solar radiation, and it can pump out a lot of water into atmosphere through the evapotranspiration, and it can store a lot of carbon through the photosynthesis. So forests can play an important role in climate regulation, and that is just one of the important ecosystem services forests has played. But what we saw wasn't a complete picture. Forest is actually a dynamic system. It is partly driven by disturbance and some other global forcing. So what is a disturbance? Disturbance is a relatively discrete event in space and time that disrupts the ecosystem, community, or population structure. There are 3 characteristics define a disturbance: a short duration, a quick change, and a higher magnitude of impact. From the forest ecosystem perspective, disturbance has 2 important roles. First, it can reset succession clock, and that would actually bring the temporal heterogeneity or temporal dimension to the forest ecosystems. And the second is that disturbance can create the patch mosaic on many landscapes, and that is what I call the spatial dimension or spatial heterogeneity brought by disturbance to the forest ecosystems. So in today's presentation, I will first describe landscape impacts of diverse disturbance agents, including wildfire, surface mining, timber harvesting, uses some of the research that I have conducted. And then I will describe some new techniques and ideas for studying the forest disturbance using some of my ongoing research projects. Then finally, I will have a conclusion remark slide. So first, let me talk about the fire. Fire is a ubiquitous disturbance. It occurs almost everywhere on the terrestrial ecosystem as long as there are some vegetation. Some places would have more frequent fires, some places have less frequent fires, but it is almost everywhere. For my own research, I have conducted the fire research in Chinese boreal forest, which is located in the southern portion of the Euro-Asian boreal forest. For today's talk, I'm going to focus on one aspect of the fire impacts on landscape, which is post-fire vegetation recovery. Earlier, I mentioned that disturbance can reset the succession clock, but that's just the one part of it. Some uncharacteristic fires, such as those fires might be too severe or might be too frequent, or it happens under different climate conditions, may lead into a different succession pathway than the system usually undergo. So such a variability would contribute to the forest structure heterogeneity and it drives the functional mosaic of forest landscapes. But to better understand such a heterogeneity of the fire, we need to quantify the heterogeneity of fire severity. So we can use remote sensing to compute a particular metric called a DNBR, which stands for differences normalized burn ratio. That's derived from the spectral indices of remote sensing. And we can then couple that with the field visit to actually verify or come up with the empirical relationship to relate the remote sensing metric with the condition on the ground. So in this particular map, what we saw is that for almost 10,000 hectare burn patch, we can use the remote sensing to quantify where the high severity burn is, where the low severity burn is. And we want to understand how such a variation of the fire severity would actually lead to different successional pathways. And we do that by also considering some other important factors, in this case, the topographic position. And we look at like the, for that particular patch, we look at it about 11 years after the fire, the vegetation recovery. The top 3 photos show the tree regeneration from the low severity burn across 3 different topographic positions, the flat and the north facing slope and the south facing hill slope. And the bottom 3 photos show the tree regeneration from the high severity burns across those 3 topographic positions. So without the fancy analysis, we immediately see that the seasoning or sapling recruitment density is much higher in the low severity burn sites. And if we are using some kind of machine learning approach, the boost regression tree to analyze our field data, we found that the DNBR, the metric for quantifying the fire severity, is the most important variable driving the post-fire large tree recruitment density, which is the one that the larch tree, by the way, is the dominant tree species in that ecosystem. And as you can see from the middle of this graph, with the increasing of the DNBR, then the large tree recruitment density reduced. Such variability would have a strong cascading effects on ANPP, the above ground net primary productivity. So on the graph to the left, what we saw is that across those 3 topographic positions, the ANPP from the low severity burn is always higher than the ANPP from the high severity burn. And although we are not able to do a chronal sequence, some other studies that have looked at the chronal sequence, such as the Monica Turner research in Yellowstone, has indicated that, well, this early, the variability of ANPP in the early succession stage can persist for much longer time and would result, this is what we call the functional mosaic of a forest landscape. And now I'd like to move on to the second disturbance agent, the surface mining. Surface mining is considered a deep disturbance because it can not only remove the biota, but also permanently change the topography. And topography is a very important driver of many land surface processes. For example, topography can determine the shading of the relief dynamically. So from the morning to the evening, as we can see here, the hill shading is different in different aspects and different topographic positions. In the northern hemisphere, generally, the north-facing aspects would receive more shading and consequently less solar radiation. And I want you to actually also look at, to the left, there is a mine watershed, and that's the area where we saw is that the topography has changed to really actually the flattened topography. So we can use the GIS to compute the solar radiation for this region. And as you can see, the north-facing aspects generally have lower solar radiation than the south-facing aspects. And as we saw from this graph to the left, this is where we don't see much variability of the solar radiation, because that's the area that has been impacted by surface mining. This is what we call the homogenization effects of surface mining on topography and the topographic-driven land surface processes. So from here, on the left, what we have is that actually pre-mining DEM data and the post-mining DEM data. And we can use GIS to compute some index such as TPI, which stands for Topographic Position Index. A high topographic position index indicates that's the ridge top. A low TPI indicates that's the stream valley bottom. And the pre-mining DEM shows that, well, the distribution of the TPI is more or less like the flatted. So they're compared to the pre-mining, the post-mining TPI shows that there's a peak in the TPI value of 0, meaning that's the flatted area. So that actually tells us that, well, at the regional level, there are less stream valley and less ridge top due to the surface mining. And we can then translate that into the solar radiation. And in this case, we look at the winter solar radiation. And as you can see, that there's a significantly less high winter solar radiation size due to the surface mining. And this homogenization has severe ecological consequences because it can disproportionately impact the ridge top habitats and cause reduction of the suitable habitats for, say, the timber rattlesnake and other ridgetop dependent biota. And but this is the project that was actually conducted by Thomas Margaret, a PhD student of John Cox. He was in my landscape ecology class, and that was his final project to look at the habitat of timber rattlesnake. And after the class, then we collaborated for like 1.5 years to look at this in a bigger context for the entire Eastern Kentucky and publish this in the frontiers in ecology and the environment. But what we saw was just the surface mining impacts on topography and the biota. But people may argue that, well, the surface mine has been reclaimed. So we also want to look at the reclamation of the surface mining. So this is a photo that I took in near the, I believe it's a Starfire. And as you can see, there are a lot of the grassland and some trees. Maybe those are the like autumn olive planted in the background. So that's kind of the typical current surface mining reclamation strategy. And in the past decades or so, many scientists and stakeholders have advocated for the forestry reclamation approach. In this case, they would advocate that to reclaim the mining site back to the forest, because forest can support a lot of ecosystem services, including the supporting of the nutrient cycling, the soil formation, provide the food, the fresh water, regulate the climate, regulate the flood, etc. So we want to use the scenario analysis to examine the benefits of the forestry reclamation approach. And here we used a particular watershed in which we identified is one of the most impacted watershed by surface mine and reclamation. To the left is the 2011 land cover data, which shows a lot of the active mining or barren land and a lot of the reclamation to the pasture. And we use the scenario analysis to say, put everything back to the forest. And then we look at how that would actually affect those ecosystem services. So in this table, we see that for the business as usual approach compared to the forestry reclamation approach, there's an increase about 13% of the carbon storage in that particular watershed. So that means that we can contribute to the climate regulation by restoring the forest into that watershed. And then there's about 5% reduction of the water yield. That's related to the flood regulation. So that's another ecosystem service benefit. In terms of sediment export, there's a 40% reduction. So that indicates that, well, the restoring the forest can really benefit the water purification, etc. So overall, we are able to show that the FRA approach do bring a lot of the ecosystem service benefits back to this landscape. But of course, we need to also be aware of that the existing reclamation have some other benefits that may sometimes outweigh the benefits that we show here. For example, the habitat for the elk, etc. Then the contribution of those grassland to the biodiversity in that landscape may be something that is not need to be looked at as kind of the balance between the ecosystem services and the biodiversity. The third disturbance that I have looked at is the timber harvesting. Harvesting is a widespread but scattered disturbance in Eastern Kentucky. These two maps were made by undergraduate student, Michael Emman. And what he did is that he used the leap imagery, the satellite, the aerial photos to delineate the harvest in Eastern Kentucky. And then he computed like the percentage of forest land being harvested. This is for only 1 year, I believe it's 2014. So we can see that within Eastern Kentucky, there are some variability in terms of the harvest rate. But as you can see, some counties would have the harvest rate as high as like 1% to 2%. So that's actually very high rotation for certain areas. But overall, as you can see on the left, the harvest patches are relatively small in Eastern Kentucky. So that's what we call the scattered disturbance. And the impacts of the timber harvesting, for my own research, I primarily look at the post-harvest invasive exotic plant species invasion. There are generally 4 stages associated with the species invasion: the transport, the colonization, the establishment, and the spread on the landscape. In each of those 4 stages, there are some filters associated with those. So in the transport stage, the physical barriers such as the ocean, the big mountain will filter out some of those IEPS. And in the colonization stage, the abiotic condition, such as the temperature and the moisture, may not be that suitable for the incoming invasive species. And then the local community or the endemic vegetation community would provide some biotic resistance to the establishment of the IEPS. And finally, the landscape may not be affected that would filter out the plants, the invasive species spread on the landscape. So what is the role of disturbance in the IEPS invasion? Well, disturbance can reduce the filters and facilitates the IEPS invasion. For example, the disturbance can increase the propagation pressure of the invasive species. They can change the temperature or moisture of the environment, which may become more suitable for the invasive species. And disturbance for sure would reduce the biotic resistance because it changes the local endemic community. And finally, disturbance may or may not actually increase the connectivity on the landscape. For the timber harvesting, I argue that, well, it can really change a lot of the filters, and the overall impacts would be would increase the or facilitate the IEPS invasion. The timber harvesting was done by the people with heavy equipment, so that actually increased the human footprint on the landscape, and consequently, it could increase the propagation pressure. And timber harvesting would change the environment, and then consequently change the resource availability, and may favor the IEPS. And finally, the tree timber harvesting would remove the trees, reduce the biotic resistance, and the extensive skid trail network associated with the timber harvest project would increase the connectivity. And I took advantage of the existing experiments that has conducted in Robinson Forest SMZ study. This study was established in 2008 and 2009. And what we look at are the 3 harvest watersheds, which are the North Shelley, the West Shelley, and the South Shelley. And there we also look at the control watershed, which is the Little Millseat. And keep in mind that those 4 watersheds are located on the west side of the west edge of the Robinson Forest, and it's located closer to some adjacent mining sites or reclamation sites. So the overall pattern that we looked at the IEPS across those 4 watersheds is that for those harvest watersheds, the North Shelley, West Shelley, and the South Shelley, more than 50% of the plots would have some kind of IEPS presence. But for the control, the Little Millseat is less than 20%. So IEPS is more pervasive in the 80-year post-harvest watersheds than in the control. And then we look at the spatial patterns of IEPS distribution and the drivers. So first we look at the skid trail and the road. And what we found is that more than 50% of the IEPS present plots were less than 5 meters away from the skid trail or road. And in contrast, less than 30% of those IEPS absent plots were within 5 meters from the trail. So generally what we found is that IEPS is more likely to be found near the skid trail and the road. We also look at the landform effects. In this case, we are looking at the solar radiation or the aspect impacts on the IEPS distribution. So from the box plot and also the histogram, as we can see that the mean solar radiation for the presence group is about 1300, but the absence group is less than 1200. So warmer aspects are more conducive to IEPS invasion than the colder or cooler aspects. We also look at the water availability impacts on IEPS. And we use a widely used GIS variable called the TWI, the Topographic Wetness Index, that has been used to capture or represent the soil moisture or water availability due to the topography. And what we found is that mean TWI was higher in the IEPS presence group, which indicates this IEPS would be more likely to be found in the wetter areas. I do want to actually zoom in this map of TWI to show you that the skid trail would actually change the TWI because the skid trail actually changes the topography. Oftentimes in the area that's closer to the skid trail, we see some of the very high TWI. And that's not really surprising because the skid trail is relatively a flat area and the water would be slowed down and accumulate in those areas. And finally, I'm looking at the Biotic filter, and which is described by the canopy cover that is estimated from the LIDAR data in 2013. And from here, what we saw based on the box plot and the histogram is that the mean canopy cover was lower in the IEPS present group, meaning that the area with reduced biotic resistance would be also the area be associated more with the IEPS. So when we use the put all those variables together and then do the ranking, we found that the landform or solar radiation is the most important one, followed by the canopy cover, and then distance to the ski trail and the road and the TWI. Sure, solar radiation is a reflection of the topography effects, and the canopy cover is a reflection of the forest regrowth. But we can also argue that the harvest will also is the underpinning driver of the spatial variability of the canopy cover in the harvest watersheds. So different areas would have different harvest intensity in the microsite scale, and that actually then also the reason why the canopy cover is showing as an important variable in determining the spatial pattern of IEPS. So overall, we would say that the landform, forest regrowth, harvest are the important factors controlling the overall IEPS distribution. But if we just focus on the woody IEPS, for example, the Trail of Heaven and then Autumn Olive, then the ranking changes. Distance to ski trail, which is the reflection of the harvest, is the most important one. And distance to the mining becomes the second important one, and followed by TWI. So this is what I call the in-situ and ex-situ disturbances effects. So what do I mean by in-situ and ex-situ disturbance? So within the Robinson Forest, harvesting is considered an in-situ disturbance. It happens within that forest, and it can facilitate the evasion of IEPS inside that forest. But surface mining is considered an ex-situ disturbance. It wasn't actually a disturbance happening within the Robinson Forest, but it can galvanize the invasion of IEPS to the forest because the surface mining would change the wind dynamics, and also the reclamation site would produce, would be associated with a lot of invasive tree species that would produce much higher propagar pressure to the surrounding forest. And we need to think of this in a broader picture. For, say, for the entire Eastern Kentucky, surface mining is very pervasive, all right? And it could have very long-lasting impacts. And those surface mining, even though it has been reclaimed, but it's reclaiming into the succession stage with grass and the many invasive species. So the cumulative impacts of the surface mining cannot be ignored when we actually look at the timber harvesting, which is happening in the Eastern Kentucky in a kind of more scattered out pattern. And the timber harvesting, post timber harvesting forest recovery is more like a dynamic and a short time, but we cannot really ignore this kind of two different kind of disturbances operating at different temporal scales, but actually then interact each other to drive some the structure and the function of the landscape. So what I really want to talk is that it's the compound disturbances, the interaction of multiple disturbances that could lead into additive, spillover, and legacy impacts one way or another. And this is what I say is a call to understand the interactive dynamic effects of multiple disturbances on the forest landscape structure, function, forest health, and ecosystem resilience. And but how we really actually then study this? I mean, we could use those traditional approach to actually to go to different places to look at those forest response to compound disturbances. But there are some new techniques that can help us really actually look at it from the broader spatial scale. Now, one particular technique that I have been worked on is the LIDAR data. So this is a LIDAR point cloud for Veterans Park area, where I'm currently doing my presentation. My home is nearby the Veterans Park. And we can use the LIDAR data to derive a canopy height model, which is basically to look at the difference between the surface elevation and the ground elevation. So we call that a canopy height, but if in the urban area, that could be at the height of any object like the house, etc. But in the forest, that is what we call the canopy height model. And we could get like the canopy height model for this particular case study area or example area. And then we can then, using the GIS to look at different groups of the canopy height. So for example, I broke the CHM into 5 groups. The height that is less than 1 feet, the height is between 1 and 5, and then the height is less than 25. The height is between 25 and 50, and then the height is from 50 to 75, and then the height is greater than 75. Actually, that's 6 groups. So then we can easily identify kind of where the tall forests are, where the short or younger forests are. And in the urban area, we can even actually capture like where the individual trees are located. And we can use the LIDAR data to look at the forest response to disturbances or the forest impacts to the disturbance impact to the forest ecosystem. So this is a tornado impact zone that located in West Liberty, Kentucky. This tornado cut 95 trench based on the weather service from the news article. And this is a portion of that tornado path. So we can use the leaf imagery to help us understand well the impact of the tornado. As you can see in the center of this buffer zone, that's where the actual tornado path is. That's where the color is changing to slightly lighter. But that's just the kind of the visualization. How can we really quantify the impact? We can use the LIDAR data. Let me see. To look at the canopy height. And you can see that those red pixels are the pixels where the canopy height is between 5 and 25 feet. And this is, the LIDAR data is, I cannot see very clearly, but the LIDAR data is derived from 2017 maybe. So that was like, I remember it's 5 years after the disturbance. So it kind of captured like the forest regrowth after that tornado. And that was just an example for the Robinson for the tornado impact region. But we can also look at the Robinson Forest, which many people from the audience probably have been to. And from this one, we can see from the leaf imagery of 2016, the kind of the traces of the recent harvest, like the North Shelley, West Shelley, and the South Shelley. But again, this is just for visualization, but we really cannot quantify the forest condition after the disturbance. Once we use the LIDAR data, we can really actually then get to the canopy height and see the differences. So as you can see, there's different color for different group of canopy height. And this is the one, is the path to the fire tower. So that's where you have some kind of very short canopy height. And then there's a canopy height that's between 5 to 25. Of course, in the middle, that's where actually you have a fire tower, which I believe is about 100 feet. And we can also see the recent harvesting in both the SMZ study, and this is, I believe it's a clear cutting in the same year as that SMZ study. And those are the even more harvesting in the Robinson Forest in the recent time. And I'm not sure if you can see that clearly, but this is a yellow patch, which is according to Jeff, and this is a pine plantation or pine conversion. And that was happened like about 25 years ago. And then we can see that it's a 25 to 50 canopy height. And this is another SMS study, but it was conducted in 1983. So this LIDAR data is 2013, so that was about 30 years after the disturbance. And the canopy height has reached to mostly 25 to 50 that status. But of course, the canopy height can tell us those historical disturbances, but it can also tell us kind of the basic influence of landform on the forest growth. So in the Little Millseat, you can see that the north facing, because it has rich soil and then wetter, etc. So the trees there is at the 75 feet or above set group, but the trees in the south facing would actually be much shorter. The LIDAR-derived forest structure is just one-time snapshot, but we can couple that with Landsat-derived disturbance history to help us better understand where those forest structures come from. So my point being that using those new geospatial technology, we can really actually help us to understand A, the cumulative impact of disturbance, and B, that will to help us understand the interaction of those compound disturbances. LIDAR data can also be used to other research like wildlife habitat modeling. And I have been working with the Zach Banks from the Kentucky Division of Wildlife to modeling the habitat of ruffed grouse, which is a game bird species declining in both regionally and in Kentucky. And it is considered an umbrella species for conservation of other young forest taxa. So basically, this particular species is a kind of specialist to the young forest, which often considered like a 5 to 20 years post disturbance. But also we need to consider the kind of the patch mosaic and the forest context when we're trying to rank the habitat for this particular species. So the key here is to find out those young forests. And we're using the LIDAR data, we are able to actually quantify the young forests, or where the young forests are in 7 WMA, the wildlife management areas, and the Robbins Forest, and the tornado buffer in eastern Kentucky. So here I'm just showing you an example. This is a 4 tracks in the Dewey Lake WMA. And this WMA is surrounded by the mining to the southeast, and the forest in the other directions. And when we use the LIDAR, we can quantify where the young forest is. And then using that information, we can then further quantify the suitable habitat for the ruffed grouse. So for those study areas, what we found is that except the Rock Castle WMA, all other study areas have very, very small proportion of the young forest, less than 5%, and most of them are even less than 3%. And consequently, the suitable habitat for those young forest type species is really small in eastern Kentucky. All right, so that's kind of the new technique that I have been worked on. And then I want to move on to some kind of new ideas that I have been working on. it's not a really new idea, and the one that I've been working is the microclimate, but it has received due attention, particularly in the climate change context. For example, just in this May, Science has published an article that documents that the forest microclimate is really the driver of the plant response to global warming. So the whole idea is that, well, forests can buffer the temperature from the warming on the free air. So generally, the understory vegetation would be buffered from the climate warming due to this buffering function provided by the forest. But I would argue that the soil moisture is also an important component of that microclimate, and it's probably even more important in our region or in many other regions for driving the tree species distribution and their response to climate change. And soil moisture is regulated by topography, and we want to look at, well, what exact topographic features are really driving the spatial variability of the soil moisture. So we use the three-way design to look at the aspect, topographic position, and the concavity effects on soil moisture variability in little Millseat. And what we found is that, well, topographic position has the greatest impacts or effect size among the three topographic features that we investigated. And really it's interesting that because before we did this research, I kind of asked around, and I kind of feel that most people think that the aspect is the most important one, driving the soil moisture and the tree species distribution. But whether we found that the topographic position has greater impacts than aspect. However, aspects do interact with TP and curvature to influence the soil moisture, and the aspect itself is also quite important. So we find that there's a very complex interaction among those three topographic features in driving the spatial variability of soil moisture. And then we look at the GIS-derived soil moisture index. There's a lot of those soil moisture index, and the most widely used one would be the TWI, which is the one that I actually showed you in the early on research that we look at the IEPS response to the water availability. So we look at not only the TWI, which actually itself has a different algorithm to calculate. We also look at the integrated moisture index, and then climate water balance, storage, deficit, and surplus. Those are really the ones that we have been, the literature have been used for quantifying the soil moisture. So what we found is that the TWI, the most widely used soil moisture index, wasn't really the best at all. It was actually the worst among those soil moisture index that we investigated. So it just speaks that, well, we need to be really careful when we're trying to understand the soil moisture with the GIS variables that are being pushed or advocated in the literature. For our study area, what we found is that the not the TWI, but the climate water deficit is probably a good one to represent the soil moisture variability. And the future improvement for this one would be the integration of TWI, climate water deficit, and the LIDAR, because the TWI has its own value. It really has a good representation of the hydrological flow impacts on the water availability, but it doesn't really represent the aspect influences. So climate water deficit, on the other hand, did represent the solar radiation impacts, but it doesn't really capture that hydrological flow impacts very well. Combine them are probably better predictor of the topographic influence on soil moisture. But we can then add the LIDAR to help us better understanding how the vegetation structure would also regulate the soil moisture on the ground. So that's kind of the future direction that I hope to work on. The last idea that I have been working is the coupling of the natural and the human system. Particularly, we are looking at how policy is affecting the disturbance. So this is the one that is a continuation with the terms, and it shows that those are the kind of the percentage of the newly mined line in 5 different topographic positions: ridge top, upslope, middle slope, lower slope, and the stream bottom. And what we saw is that about 2010, there is a significant decline of the proportion of the stream bottom being mined, but there's actually an increase of the ridge top being mined. So that actually speaks to, say, the Obama's policy that is more regulative, regulate more, that actually have the impacts on the regional topographic response or impacts by the surface mining. Another one that I've been working with Thompson Altrodo was to look at the ownership impacts on disturbance and ecosystem services. So we know that, well, the Kentucky forest is mostly owned by the family owners. And there are then corporate owners and then public, including the state and the Daniel Boone. And we can look at it like the forest change across those 3 ownerships, and also the ecosystem service changes across those ownerships. So in conclusion, I want to basically say that, well, there are multiple disturbance agents, and they all have their own individual, but also some kind of commonality in terms of their impacts on the forest landscape. And we really need to look at the compound disturbance. We cannot just look at one disturbance at a time. We need to look at the complex interactions, both like the disturbance that are happening within our forest, or the disturbance that are happening within the forest and adjacent to the forest. And I would argue that we need to focus on the marriage between ecology and the geoscience. I mean, ecology is really to look at the organism response to the environment, and geoscience is really to have a better, a different angle on the land surface processes. And we need to really look at the both together, because the disturbance not only affects the organisms, but also the environment, and particularly the land surface. Sorry. And then lastly, we need to look at the disturbance from the human and the natural system framework. So I always think that the landscape is the central stage where the disturbance and the humans do play together, and we need to look at them all together. And finally, I'd like to thank you all to participate in this seminar. And this is a drone video that is I took for the veterinary park area, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.